Omaya woman, Omania Mamana, Geni baby, one pa, Asaase pa wofio ye, Gamo Embera ye, Abeya Ifina, Omaya woman, Omaya Mamana, Adiwaya Nora, Yamichata, Yamana Rena, Onso, one pa, so I wanna be, Gamo Embera ye. Asaase pa wofio, Gamo Embera ye, Abeya Ifina, Amabeya Ifina, Amabeyo, Asite Beya Ifina, oh, Amabeya Ifina, Yana, Gamo Embera ye, Abeya, Obrayu Arabo.
The 2021 budget appears ripe, and information circulating on social media have spotted indicates that the government's budget is ready. The country has been waiting for it. The president presented the State of the Nation's address recently, and that clearly indicates that government's economic policy is ready not only for our consumption but for implementation. Tonight, we're going to look at this conversation. And with me to go through this is Dr. Theophilus Achampon, who is an economic and political risk analyst. He's well versed in the subject. I'm not ready to go into the details of his qualification, which is indeed enormous. At this stage, may I just welcome to the discussion Dr. Theo Achampon. Dr. Theo Achampon, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I just spotted the budget. It's making the rounds on social media. I'm not sure if you have seen it.
Yes, I actually got a chance to see it probably about less than an hour ago. But the findings or what is reported in it are not too sort of dissimilar if you've been following development in Ghana's economy for a while now. So I would say there's nothing entirely in there that would take you by surprise if you have been following one has been following Ghana's economic trajectory.
Your response, therefore, suggests to me that you have taken a snapshot view of the budget. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, certainly. I have had a chance to look at peruse a few pages. What I've got is a 48-page document. Of course, I mean, the important thing really is to dig into the numbers, especially with the impact of COVID and, of course, what one needs to do with the post-COVID economic growth.
So given the dynamics of everything, does the budget meet your expectations? In other words, were you expecting a budget that should reflect what you just saw?
Yes and no. So maybe let's start with some of the positives. The positives here being that the government clearly recognizes the impact that COVID has had on the economy, but also has taken some steps to mitigate the social and economic impact of COVID. But going forward, the big challenge that kind of faces the country, I think, is like twofold: how to raise more money, and also how to kind of scale back or cut back on consumption, but in a way that allows you to invest at the same time in some of the productive sectors of the economy. And that is like the three paradigms that is facing the government at the moment. On the revenue front, if you've been following our listeners have been following the numbers, you would COVID had a big impact on the revenue equation. I think at one point revenues were almost down about 20 or so % compared to what had been budgeted or set in the year. But we saw an uptick in economic activity starting about the last quarter of last year, and that then meant that the deficit or the shortfall in the revenue has not been as bad as the earlier assessment when we were looking at it. If you went back to like July, when the finance minister presented the supplementary budget to the House. But on the other side of the equation is your expenses, and we've been spending a lot of money to beat our way through the pandemic. And if you take your revenue and adjust for the expenses, then we're actually looking at a big loophole in the budget. So we are looking at almost 12 to 30% deficit for 2020. And what that then means is that we have to find that money from somewhere to plug that loophole or that gap. But with the way things are at the moment, it's a bit difficult to finance that domestically. So one of the other ways is then the government has to go and borrow, right, from the external market. And they're saying that they're looking at borrowing up to about 5.
Okay, so can you hear me? I think your line is a bit...
Also billion USD.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Dr. Champion?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so sorry, I think your line tripped. But if you may mop up on that, I actually we'll come to the question of the borrowing and the domestic, the public debts, among others. But for now, the key question I want to ask you, and if you may respond, and I think you've mentioned partly the issue of COVID. So to what extent does the budget respond to COVID and the difficulties of targets? Because invariably the targets and the estimates of government's revenue and expenditure and others clearly should reflect the capacity and the reality of our collection. And I think that COVID invariably represents a big elephant in the room which cannot be ignored. To what extent does the budget reflect the challenge of COVID and clearly how government is going to have to deal with the pandemic vis-a-vis its own shortfall in revenue?
Yeah, so two answers to that. It already has reflected that in terms of the initiatives that they're going to undertake in 2020. And so starting from July, when the finance minister went to the House to present the supplementary budget, a lot of money was spent on the fiscal side of the equation. And even at one point, the Bank of Ghana also stepped in to reduce like the monetary rate. So that already has happened. The big thing now is how to sustain and to deliver growth in a post-COVID world. So how to deliver, for example, 7 percentage point growth, which is what we used to experience from 2016 right through till about 2019 before the pandemic did hit. So all those things are reflected in this current budget. The question I have, just perusing, and I haven't gone into all the details, I would concede, really is where are the finances going to come from to fund some of the programs and the proposals for 2021? And are there other areas, right, that we could possibly scale back on and help us kind of plug that?
And that brings us back to the challenge of COVID and the threats of COVID. So once you have an issue with the shortfall in revenue shortfall in government revenue generation, and you have, on the other hand, massive expenditure proposal in the character, for example, of Ghana Cares, which is supposed to, exact as much as 100 billion cedis on the Ghanaian revenue. Do you see in the budget specific proposals and particular policy interventions and strategies designed to ensure that the 100 billion Ghana cedis for Ghana Cares, for example, among others, that, as you indicated, we will be able to generate the revenue to support these policies?
Yes. So Ghana Stand would be funded by a mixture of private and public sources, and the private component is about 70 or so odd percent, and the bit that comes from direct government subvention is around 30% or 30 billion of the 100 billion that it's been proposed to use. So because, and you can see, because of the difficulty that you just explained in terms of the revenue gaps and the shortfalls, the government has actually had to go outside to borrow, right, to fund this Ghana Cares program. Of course, invariably, that is going to add on to the national debt. But we also do know that if those monies are used properly, then it should ultimately help in expanding the productive base. So, for example, in agriculture and some of the related infrastructure that they want to do. The challenge I have, as always, with these things is I am guided by history, and guided by history in the sense that we have borrowed some of these monies in the past and still don't really have much to show for in terms of the productive investments that would then add on to the economic base. So what then happens is that you end up creating more debt and more debt instruments, but the revenue side of the equation really doesn't grow as much as what you're adding onto the debt.
We will look at the public debt again, and sorry to cut you, we'll look at the question of public debt, but for now, on the question of revenue generation, do I understand from your answer that you still support debt financing by way of external debts and by way of borrowing?
Every government borrows, and certainly I think that given the circumstances that we find ourselves in, where we're not collecting enough domestic revenues, despite all the talk about digitalization, etc. Necessarily you have to go out to the market to borrow. But actually, right now within the external market, if you observe carefully, we've seen some sort of favorable development in the external market. So immediately with COVID, we saw like the sovereign yields or the spikes go up, where if you wanted to go and borrow around that time, your cost of borrowing and servicing that debt would have been much higher. Subsequently, we've actually seen a lot of the the yields go down to pre-COVID levels, and the current environment actually is quite favorable to support external borrowing. So it's not just Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia. All these countries are looking at going out to the external market to borrow to support their budget. So the problem is not the borrowing as such. The problem has always been what you use the money for. And number two, the domestic bit of your revenues, what you're doing to collect enough such that over time you should have a decent ratio of borrowings vis-a-vis, or external borrowings vis-a-vis domestic revenue collection. Unfortunately, in our part, we actually are borrowing a lot more from the external market. And the last time I checked, we have almost $12 billion dollars of Eurobonds, right, sitting on our books, some of which mature in the next few years, and we need to pay the principal on those in addition to whatever interest.
What is and I hear you about the fact that borrowing is not a problem. We can borrow so long as we use it properly and efficiently. But what is the problem with the tax collection, particularly the broadening of the tax base? The issue of tax justice, everybody paying his fair share and distributing taxes in a way that gets everybody paying. What is it that has made the collection of taxes so enigmatic from government to government? It is not peculiar to the NPP. It is not peculiar to the NDC. In fact, it's not even peculiar to the two governments. Military governments have come and gone. What is the issue with tax collection that only a few in the formal sector pay for everybody else, and there are so many people who are not in the formal sector at all, but who actually probably earn way more, in many cases earn way more than people in the formal sector? What is it?
In fact, I was looking for some numbers to put even things into context. And on the tax
what is the
issue.
fundamental problem? What is it that there's something enigmatic here? I mean, I am trying to understand why government to government they've always suffered with collection. What is the problem with tax collection?
I think it's a political economy issue, right? If you have a government, and let's be blunt, if you have governments come in and go, and they find it much more easier to go to the external markets to borrow, then they will always find that easier route rather than doing the hard work that is required to actually connect the system. So most of our thing, the problem really is that hitherto we had all these agencies, databases that are sitting, or sometimes even the databases don't exist, and they don't talk to each other. And it becomes very difficult to actually go on that basis and ask people to pay tax. So what then happens? The easiest thing is for the government to wake up and say, well, I'm going to slap an ad valorem tax, right? So everybody uses petrol, so let's tax petrol. People use credits for their telephony, so let's put an ad valorem tax on that. Instead of the hard graft that is required to fix the structural or fundamental issues. The structural issues are about systems. So it's your ID systems, your database systems, knowing where people live, and going after them and ensuring that like they're paying, for example, the right amount of property tax, right? That's at the central level. That even can be devolved, to the regional level if we have an effective decentralization system in place. But these key nuts or components that need to go together, every government comes and we are just tinkering at the edges.
Do you therefore see the recent government announcement that there's going to be an integration of identity? Digitization together with integration of identity. The Ghana card will be linked to your passport, will be linked to your TIN. Do you see that as an effective response strategy?
I think it will help. I mean, there will be a lag, right? So it is not going to be that suddenly you have 15 million people, as we're reading in the news, having their national ID cards now being used as a tax identification number. It doesn't follow that immediately you're going to get them in a tax-paying position. No. There typically will be a number of because you need to do public education. But also, the citizens need to feel that if I am paying tax, then the government is actually using the money, right, appropriately, and I can see value for what is being used. But in the minds of maybe quite a number of citizens, people feel like, yeah, we pay, but we don't get any value out of it. So we end up privatizing the solutions or things that the public service or government should have provided. So if I don't have water, what do? Well, I might go and buy a polytank for argument's sake. Or if I am struggling with the road in front of my house, people within the area may come together and go and hire like a big trailer or tractor to come and grade the road for them. If I don't see my money being used and it being used in a way and manner that delivers value, then nobody is actually going to pay tax. So it goes both ways. It's the steps that are being taken now. Yes, it helps, and overnight you have quote unquote potential taxpayers, but it does not translate straight away into people actually paying tax.
We'll come back to the issue. Thank you. We'll come back to the issue of the public debt, taxes, etc. again. I would just at this stage like to announce that you are still on Townhall Talk on Asaase Radio. The program is sponsored by the Magdan Shipping Company Limited, your total logistics partner. And I have Dr. Theo Achampong, who is an economist and political risk analyst, with me having a conversation about the budget, which just came out, or is certainly making the news and the rounds on social media. And my understanding is that it's been presented to Parliament, and we're having a look at the economic issues that are implicated thereby. One question I'm going to ask you, and the key question is this. This budget, just like the many other budgets before it, has been using or appears to be using the standard mechanism or model of measuring economic success, the GDP. Issues of GDP, issues of inflation, the standard things, the standard instruments that you economists use to measure the health of an economy. Do you think that we've gotten to a point where in determining the health of an economy and the success of economic policies, we should move a bit away from these traditional instruments of measurement, as some people would just say they do not reflect the realities on the ground, i.e., we may have a case of, excellent GDP growth, a case of substantial reduction in inflation, all these, some will even call it abstract instruments. All these instruments may look good on paper, but the reality is kinky prices don't appear to be getting better. Have we gotten to the point where we should start looking at economic success from a different angle? And from your perspective, what do you say to that?
I absolutely agree. I've been championing for this for maybe the last 3 or 4 years. And this is the big problem with a number of developing countries, including Ghana. So the macroeconomic numbers, the GDPs, may look good on paper, right? And say, well, the economy is growing at 7% a year, etc. But it does not necessarily translate sometimes into gains at the micro level, at the developmental level, where it's all about bread and butter, right, issues. So I have been canvassing and championing that we need a much more inclusive, or other inclusive metrics in the budget besides or added on to the GDP. And I'll tell you how my thinking is. In the budget, you see that they would present, agriculture sector, they would present health sector, they present the broad macro overview, present, roads, highways, etc. But very rarely do I see it being connected in terms of an input, an output, and outcomes. Let me explain this in a moment. Most of the developmental thinking, as I've seen in Ghana in the last maybe 20 or so years, is more around, let's build more roads, let's build more hospitals, let's build more schools. But we don't put in an effort to actually ask ourselves, how would the road that is being built or the school or the hospital ultimately translate into health outcomes, right? And bridging those health inequalities, or improve education outcomes, or even improve, say, energy access rate or energy security. And what I think is lacking in terms of the metrics and what we measure is to have a composite framework that says we are starting from this point, just like we do with GDP. Let's take education and have a set of clear benchmarks and metrics that we can actually measure tangibly at the raw level, and use that to also report those numbers in addition to the GDP. Because that's the only way you begin to actually make sense, right, of the GDP numbers, and you ask yourself whether that is translating to the grassroots. So my philosophy, orientation of thinking is to move away a bit from the macroeconomic numbers or indices. Not that they are not important, they are, but we need more of other indices and other measures that are connected to the real economy, right? So, and also output driven.
Right. So in a more substantive indexing, one of the criticisms that's been leveled against GDP, and, especially in the case of Ghana, using the GDP standard of measurement, is the case of jobless growth, i.e. the economy appears to be growing year on year, but the jobs are not there. And the jobs that come are not sustainable. They are not self-dependent. They probably have to be propped by a government subsidy, among others. How do we deal with one of the fundamental challenges of our economic development across time? It's been the case for quite some time. The case of the universities churning out over 70,000 graduates per year, but we have the job growth rate way lagging behind, and our economy appearing to be growing. Somehow it's growing without jobs. How do we deal with the fundamental difficulty of the jobless growth? And I'm not sure if you've seen the numbers on the jobs as far as the recent budget that just came out is concerned, so that you can connect your answer to that.
I haven't seen the numbers, but I do share your concerns, and the concern being that growth without jobs. And it's easy to see because if I come and say I'm investing like $1 billion and I build a road, okay, I may hire a few hands, and that helps to boost the GDP, but you actually don't create employment. And we need to make that distinction, right, between jobs and proper, like, skills-based employment. And what governments have done, with no criticism to any government, is they come in and announce all sorts of programs, NYE, PYE, etc. But they are not connected in a way that actually creates sustainable long-term employment, not even necessarily jobs. So they're just like tokens, right? Handouts. And then once the government is kicked out, another one comes in and brings its own thing. The fundamental problem, I think, has to do with the labor market, but also has to do with how we actually approach things in terms of the structure of the economy. So let me use a couple of things to explain. We've got 50% of the, just a little under 50% of the economic base coming from the services sector of the economy. That's all well and good, but it doesn't necessarily create the enough long-lasting jobs that you require.
Which of the sectors do you think will be the best generating jobs, assuming that you're to proffer advice and government is listening?
I mean,
the government has a whole policy in the area of planting for food and jobs. So, jobs and agriculture. Which area would you recommend?
No, I think we need a multifaceted approach. So you have to take it like a pyramid, right, and build it from the base. And you've got to take it, for me, sector by sector, and do the diagnostic work and understand the constraints in the sector and what you need to do to actually support, that. But also, I think sometimes even government is the biggest impediment in all of this because, in one sense, the government says they want to help private sector. In another sense, government is borrowing unnecessarily from the domestic commercial market and crowding out the private sector who need access to these loans and facilities for them to expand their productive economic base. So the answer to that is I won't necessarily prefer just one sector over the other. I think we've got to look at it on a multi-sectoral level, but we need a policy coordination focus that says that if I take education, if I take agriculture, if I take health, if I take, say, the energy, how many sustainable long-term employment can actually be created beyond just some of the tokenist measures that we've seen, in which if the government, is kicked out today and a new one comes, then, things are changed overnight.
And so your recommendation, like you indicated, is multi-sectoral. But I guess the point I wanted to drive home and wanted your response on is government appears to have identified agriculture. Agriculture traditionally has been said to employ the largest number of the workforce of Ghana. And so for many years, agriculture appeared to employ more than 60% of the entire workforce. And so the identification of agriculture, would you applaud that? Now, if you would applaud that, would you say the current approach, the mechanism that is being used to exploit agriculture as the lead workforce employment sector is appropriate? So is agriculture appropriate? And if it is the model or the mechanism being used, the planting for food and jobs,
food and jobs, yes,
equally appropriate?
Yep.
Yes.
One district, one warehouse, all of that. Yes. I think there are some good things that have been done and are continuing to be done. We must give the government credit for attempting to address some of the structural issues in the agriculture value chain. And with some of the numbers that have been reported, we actually have seen some increase in agricultural productivity, like on a year-by-year basis. That's all well and good. The one thing I would add to that is I want to see that year-on-year increase in growth also translate into productivity. So what I mean by that really is we still, in a lot of places, are doing this cutlass and hoe model of agriculture. And I would love to see a mechanism or a structure that shifts from that, where, for example, the farmer in my town, right, of Ejimako in the central region, can actually get access to very decent or basic implements. So, like you see the Abubuya, they call it, that they use the tricycle or an expanded sickle, things like that, that helps them overnight to triple or double their yields. But also what that does is it connects you to your industrial sector. So what that does is, instead of us, saying that we want to assemble cars in Ghana, it's great. I mean, assembling VWs, Nissans, that creates some jobs. What I would love to see is extra support being diverted to and supporting companies that would come and assemble these simple implements in Ghana. And, you connect that to your technical education as well, right? So people living like your polytechnics and the SecTech, etc., actually are employed in producing or mass producing these agricultural implements. And that's just an example I'm giving. That then helps you overnight to solve 2 or 3 problems. So you create sustainable long-term jobs, you create technology transfer, but at the same time, you're actually supporting the agriculture sector, where the farmer in Ejimako is actually doubling and tripling his yield and not just using the cutlass and hoe. That is something that I'd love to see added onto it.
We both clearly haven't had the opportunity, unfortunately, to digest the budget because it just came out. And so we've just had, a hish-hash look at it. There's a danger in these analyses to either misquote or to run ahead of yourself since you haven't looked at it. And so at this stage, there should be the benefit of the doubt to the budget that it's actually done what it's supposed to do. I'm sure we'll have another opportunity of looking at it.
I think there's a line item in the budget on the Ghana Cares program that attempts to do what just described in terms of creating that connection between the agriculture sector and the industrial sector and then the education sector and the skill side.
Right. So
but I haven't seen the full details yet.
We all haven't done that. So I think that we'll have the opportunity, hopefully, in the near future, to speak to the budget in terms of what actually we've seen. For now, we can only guess, and it will not be fair to the budget to be making assumptions which may actually have been catered for, but it's not there. So I totally understand your handicap. But the question I'm going to ask you, and therefore this is going to be recommendatory, assuming it's there, great. If it's not recommendatory, how do we structure a budget that is pro-poor, particularly in a COVID-ridden era where a lot of people have lost jobs, where many companies, are struggling to barely survive, where the whole economy is undergoing somewhat of a transformation and transition, and we're all trying to figure out where exactly things should fall, where exactly all the chips should fall. How do we structure an economy which is not only pro-poor, but also has all the requisite safety nets? Would you recommend a budget which has adequate safety nets, particularly for a lot of people who simply can't compete? Other economies, the U.S. has just passed the $1.9 trillion
fiscal package.
The support that we don't have. We clearly don't have that kind of money. We don't have the money to pass stimulus bills, the luxury of passing stimulus bills and basically just putting things in people's bank accounts. And as you listen to the news, you wish you have a bank account on the other side of town. But we don't have that. We don't have that luxury. But how do we have a budget that responds to the COVID difficulty, particularly from the standpoint of safety nets?
Yeah, good question you've asked. We had in the past a couple of safety nets or social safety net program. One that comes off the top of my head was LEAP, and I do know during the big days of COVID, so last year, when the finance minister went to the House to present the supplementary budget, they expanded the coverage of LEAP, and they also provided some few safety, quote-unquote, net for people in the SME sector. So some loans here and some other facilities. The biggest problem I have, even with these safety nets that we've got is how to even count people. So we need to rope in people and be able to know where they live, where they exist. Because if you can't measure, then we don't know. So we end up, yes, providing some support in there, but the money often tends to end up going, not down the drain, but we can't track, right, and measure and see the policy response to that. So the point for me is, if I give somebody an extra 100 cedis beyond what they're already receiving on a monthly basis, I am interested in knowing, did that increase, right, their consumption effect or levels? Are they substituting the goods or things that they're consuming at the household level? Are they investing extra in the healthcare needs, right, of their children? All of these things are particularly important for me. For policy purposes. But I think what we often tend to do is, there's a crisis, let's support the deprived, and then once you throw that money down there, we don't tend to necessarily follow up. In the past, budgets that we have created tend to actually have a pro-poor component in it. So if you go back to when we had the GSD 1 and 2, so Ghana Shared Growth and Development Agenda, and we had a couple of other, budgets along those lines in the mid 2000s, right, about the late 2000s. You tend to see a lot of like these pro-poor interventions, and that's all well and good. I think some of that has been carried forward through, but the issue for me is to be able to reach out to the people and to know where they live and to count them. Because if we know, like in the US case, the only reason why people are getting those fiscal stimulus, etc., through the banks is because they know where they live, right? And they can count them. But in our case, we just, often do policy, sometimes even by administrative fiat. What the government says, it is what it is, and there's no way of measuring.
The AFCFTA has come into force and is in operation. Ghana holds the secretariat, and in my estimation, that presents a huge opportunity, but it also represents a huge threat.
Yep.
How risky, or what is the extent of our risk and opportunity relative to the AFCFTA in terms of revenue mobilization, given the duty-free, the tariffs, the removal of tariffs that we're supposed to have on the various goods? To what extent is that going to impact on government revenue generation, and to what extent are we going to have a flooding of our markets if our industries are not competitive, especially in the era of COVID?
Yeah, in fact, yes, yesterday I participated in an AFCTA forum, which I was part of the team that planned and put together. And these were the big questions that were on the table for discussion. There are segments of industry in Ghana that clearly has some comparative as well as competitive advantage to actually take massive or make double, triple their revenue earnings on the basis of the AFCTA. Example of that is pharmaceuticals. In the discussion that was had yesterday, the guys there made it very clear, and you can see that they have built capacity over time, and they're able to manufacture a lot of these drugs to like the highest standards. So the whole idea of trade is that you need standards to govern the trade. And if you are to benefit from it, then you've got to make sure that you have superior standards, and those standards, your industries are imbibing them and using it, right, as the basis of production going forward. So in that sense, that is where really I think we need to up our game in terms of the quality of the manufacturing processes, in terms of like our packaging, in terms of the technical word we use here is called the phytosanitary standards, right? All those things needs to be done And once we do that, it means that we actually are, I think, in a position to export to the wider African and even the West African sub-region. Because the reverse is also true. The reverse is that if you don't position yourself, other countries would come and take advantage from, or other companies from other countries will come and take advantage of your market. And there are a few industries in Ghana that we have identified and not from some dumping, right, related practices. But I still think that overall, it's the UFCT is a massive opportunity for Ghana to really, for once, push forward through this whole idea of, export diversification, and export diversification based on the agri-chain value-added services that we have, light manufacturing. We've got some advantage there. You've got to start with what you have, the low-hanging fruits, before we think about, heavy industry.
So given the tax difficulties of broadening the tax base, which has traditionally been a challenge in terms of revenue mobilization, and given the potential loss of revenue at the ports because of the removal of tariffs and the potential influx of goods, what advice do you give, particularly to government, to ensure that the losses are minimized and that we're able to offset some of those, loss in revenue from other sectors? We're able to counterbalance those from other sectors. Are we going to have to?
I think the loss.
Are we going to have to?
Sure.
Are we going to have to up the duty payable on goods originating from outside the AFCFTA zone, for example, to make up for that? Or are we going to just have to broaden the domestic tax base so that, we get a lot more people who are not paying currently just to pay? What is your recommendation in that respect?
Yeah. No, I think the loss in revenue is actually going to be a temporary thing. I've seen, I've read some papers that attempt to estimate or quantify the potential loss in revenue. Last year, there was a big paper that was done by the World Bank team, and I myself am involved with a few other researchers on the side trying to do something similar. I think it's going to be more of a short-term issue rather than a long-term issue. And it really all depends on what we do. Because whether you like it or not, right, we've signed the AFCT, it's coming, or it's even started in operation. So the real question is how you position yourself. Forget about the lost revenues for a moment, but how we position ourselves to export more. Because for every dollar that you lose in potential loss like import revenues at the port, you can actually generate more than $1 in terms of your exports. And those two sides go hand in hand. So I do think that you would have some losses in revenue at the port. It means you need to step up your domestic revenue mobilization, increase the digitalization, the attempt to connect all the payment systems and gateways together. All these things are great. But fundamentally, at the core, what we need to do is to export more and create more value addition and position Ghana as the manufacturing or industrial hub of West Africa. Because if we can do that, then whatever you lose by way of the new tariff arrangement, it doesn't really matter because you're also benefiting. And this time around, you're even benefiting to the extent that you've actually turned around the structure of the economy. So you are adding value, you're exporting rather than spending, all your foreign exchange, importing things, including like toothpick and bicycle spokes, right, into the system or the economy.
Speaking of exporting more, one of the key highlights of this budget is its recognition of the fact that the commodity prices have fluctuated and in some ways suffered, even in the COVID era. And the projection is that we probably are not going to see a massive spike in commodity prices. And so in terms of hope, one cannot hope so much on this. Specifically on the case of cocoa, I think the record is clear that Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are producing about 60% of global cocoa, which industry is over $150 billion, and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire probably getting maybe less than 3% of all that, or even much less. There's a need for us to leverage on that. How do you see the AFCFTA model as a response, for example, to our lack of control on commodity prices, and how these tend to impact on our economies and obviously undermine the structure of our economies? Our economies are structured to be primary commodity oriented, and we export them and we have no control over the prices. People who buy them decide how much to give us, and then they make billions of dollars and we make next to nothing. How do we use the after? Is the AFCFTA model, for example, conducive to, say, primary commodity trading in Africa?
Yes and no. And it comes down to, for me, the coordination between these two big producers to actually add, or like you said, add more value. Interestingly, when you study Ghana or most of Africa's economic history, we've been talking about value addition for probably 50 or so years now. And in most recent time, you can go back to the structural adjustment programs, right, of the 80s coming through to the 90s. The point really is that at the core, for me, I feel it's a political economic problem, and we're thinking around the edges. Luckily, last year we saw, or the year before, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire come together to create a so-called OPEC of cocoa. So they actually are going to coordinate like their production policies, and they're going to put in place additional investment to expand or add a value to the cocoa beans. I think the last time I checked the numbers, Ghana is processing around 30 or so % of the cocoa beans, but we can certainly do, I think, a double of that, if not more, in the next couple of years. But what AFCTA does, or allows us to do, is to do or coordinate our policies together, in this case Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and set up a domestic manufacturing plant and hubs to do the processing on an agglomeration basis, right? So you can have one plant, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in one country or the other. You can lobby for it, but you can have one plant that takes advantage of the cocoa or the beans coming in and exporting, right, from there. So you've added, or you've turned the beans into cocoa paste or cocoa liquor, and this is beans from Ghana as well as Cote d'Ivoire. And then you also have a coordinated policy where you're providing similar incentives to your farmers and the value chain and the associated kind of like grassroots. And that way, what happens then is that we would end up adding a lot more value. We certainly go beyond the 30-something or so percentage, probably to more than 50%. But the small footnote point I would also add is, of course, we also need more domestic consumption of the goods, right? Ourselves. You'll be shocked that there are people who produce cocoa, but actually have never tasted chocolate, right? Before. And we need to also consume a lot more of these products domestically, which itself is the function of the income levels, right, in the country across the board.
Well, that then ties in again. Speaking of primary commodities, that then also ties in with the issue of gold, which is cocoa and gold are two major primary products in this country. Probably timber.
Oil as well.
Now oil, yes, certainly now oil.
Yes.
And we'll look at oil very shortly. But in terms of cocoa, that brings in, therefore, into sharp focus the conversation on Ejapa. Over the years, we've had the exploitation of gold. We've had the payments of royalties. And then these have been paid. I mean, these have been used by government for all kinds of projects. But is there not a case that, given the fact that we're going to have these payments made for some time to come, it is important for us to have some planning, and that planning can be in the character of investments. Do you support or see the sense in the EJAPA model, the EJAPA deal, that it's important for Ghana to apply its sustainable and predictable collection by way of royalties in an investment vehicle, which allows us to then maximize the benefits of these, as opposed to just receiving them and applying them traditionally as we've had to all kinds of developmental projects that comes upstream, sporadically. Is there a case for us to go by the Japan model, which is proposing, so to speak, an investment vehicle? And if so, what are your concerns and what are some of your comments in terms of the entire public conversation or discussion surrounding it, which the president has indicated will be revisited?
I wrote a lot about it when it became quite topical late last year. The problem with EJAPA is not necessarily the investment side, right, of it, or how the model will work or not work. There were, I think, two fundamental problems. The fact that people or other stakeholders in the game were not fully brought in and apprised of what government seeks to do and what EJAPA actually means, right, for the country. So you see that the CSO group or community of which I'm part of, even like the local chiefs, right, who also have some sort of right or claim to the royalties, although under the Minerals Income Investment Fund, DS is sort of ring fence. All these different stakeholders said that no, we need a bit more thought and a bit more clarity around EJAPA and what specifically the government seeks to do. And then there was the other issue around, the whole valuation approach. And I think for me, much more philosophically also, the question then is, okay, if you want to create an investment vehicle and float it, why don't the government, control have a much bigger share beyond the 51% that is being proposed? And in any case, the idea of wanting to address, because one of the things they said was that they want to address the volatility associated with the
government's response on the issue of the 51% is that those shares are being sold precisely to raise revenue. So in other words, their revenue generating mechanism. And so why keep all the percentage when you can actually sell some to raise money precisely for the purposes of funding development?
Yeah, but the money being raised, which is around 500 million, something in that range, is with current gold prices, the money is being raised is like equivalent to 2 years of production of gold, right, from these mines in any case. And number two, nothing also stops at, says that we won't have more production from some of the other mines, that are yet to come on stream. So regardless, you still have the issue of the volatility to deal with. I wasn't particularly convinced by the sort of investment model or the approach where we're going through a Jersey company and listing it in London, when again we haven't even shown with the 200 or so million of mineral royalties that comes in every year, we haven't shown what those monies are being used for because it's going into the consolidated fund. Let's ring fence it, do something with that domestically, and then if we can actually show that it works, then maybe we think about EJAPA. I think we perhaps were jumping a little bit ahead, and as I've said, some of the other stakeholders were not, fully apprised of the issue, so there was a lot of, fury back and forth, around that.
On the question of oil, and before I get to oil, may I again introduce the program as Townhall Talk on Asaase Radio. With me having a discussion today is Dr. Theo Achampon, an economist and a political risk analyst, on the question of oil. oil has come upstream and has become a major component of the budget. To what extent do you think that oil revenues have shored us up, particularly with the challenge of COVID? To what extent has oil revenue played a significant role in shoring things up? And, significantly, the government has successfully implemented the free SHS and, haven't depended on oil revenue. Is that correct? And to what extent has oil significantly shored up the budget, shored up the risk factors of COVID, and continue to push us through some of these major flagship policies that need financing?
So the economy is driven by these 3 or 4 commodities, which includes oil. With the commodity oil price downturn that we saw early part of last year, the government originally, if you look at the 2020 budget that was presented in November of 2019, the government was anticipating to raise close to $1 billion of oil revenues, most or some of which would have gone to support the free SHS through the ABFA, so the annual budget funding amount. When I last checked the numbers, I think we've got a little around 600 or so million, because there's a recovery in oil prices in a bit of the latter half of the year. So it is absolutely crucial, and it is a fundamental part of the revenue or the resource envelope, particularly for free SHS. But the problem with oil revenue now is, as we always do, we're treating it as another revenue stream. Even some time ago, people were calling for us to even go and touch the Heritage Fund. So, the revenues are split in 3 ways. For every CD that comes in, 70 pesos goes into the budget, 21 pesos goes to the stabilization fund, which you call on when things or when the economy is facing difficulties, and then another 9% or 9 pesos goes into the Heritage Fund. But there was some time that there were calls to even go and use the other 9 that we have in the fund, primarily because there were severe liquidity constraints facing the government. There are issues with oil revenue. There are issues with some of the accountability around that, in terms of government being forthcoming on the investments they have made with the ABFA component. And this is well documented in the PIAC reports of the last few years. But oil is a big part of the resource envelope. We've got a couple more fields that are due to come on stream in the next few years.
Not to interrupt you, but I want to ask you this very fundamental question. Do we even need the Heritage Fund? Do we even need to follow the models of Norway, which is a country that is not only saturated with oil and reserves, but it's a first world country where everyone pretty much has a bank account catered for by the state at a certain, do we have to, for a country like Ghana with major and massive liquidity challenges, and you're saying there was a time there were liquidity challenges, we have liquidity challenges literally every time. Yes. For a country like Ghana, do we have to follow the models, the luxury, what I think in some ways could be luxury models of other countries, and set up a heritage fund, not even for a rainy day, but just for the sake of generations? Do we really have to go that?
I have or maybe let me disagree with you a bit on that. So my philosophical fundamental disagreement is this: if you have used 70 pesos out of 1 CD, you also used another 21 pesos, right? So add that together, that gives you 91 pesos, right? And then out of all of that, you now say that the 9 pesos that is left that you're keeping aside for, because you want to build a pot, right? And also to support other future needs and all of that. We're saying that let's spend all the money today and not have anything set aside. That's small. So my point is, if 91 pesos didn't do anything for you, what would 9 pesos do? You get me? And that's how I kind of approach this, that I think we've got to go back and ask serious questions of what the 70% or 70% is being used for the ABFA has been spent on. And there are numerous reports that shows you that we spend those monies thinly. We've done projects are half done, they are not complete. Another government comes in, they start something new,
I'll tell you,
and it's all littered all over the place.
I'll tell you what that 9% or whatever percentage you mentioned, what it would do if the 70 didn't do much. And here's the thing: if we have spent a significant portion of our oil revenue on free SHS, a policy that generally has been seen as a success, I mean, almost difficult to implement, and it has happened. And then you are spending whatever amount else you need or you have in the oil kitty on, say, the LEAP, the livelihood empowerment policy, for example, or any other social safety net policy, which you agreed should be a fundamental feature of the budget, given the times we live in. Don't you think that it would be good to have some savings, it would be good to have some rainy day something, it would be good to have some generational account for, the people who are all partakers of the environment of which we export the oil, we exploit the oil. But having said that, wouldn't it be important for us to use whatever we need to use for whatever is necessary? Of course, I agree with you, rationally and efficiently, but whatever is necessary. You don't think so?
Yeah, but we already support LEAP. I mean, if you look at the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, I think it's Act 815 or 854, one of it. There are like 11 priority areas that the government has to invest in using the oil mines or the ABFA components. And one of which is, I think, yes, supporting some of these social interventions, LEAP, you name it, etc. And I've been involved in projects, right, for some of which were funded by the FCDO that assessed on, they looked at the likelihood of funding programs like LEAP with oil revenues. But in all those calculations or estimations that we did, bottom line was that you could still support some of these programs without having to go and touch the Heritage Fund. For me, fundamentally, I am against touching the Heritage Fund. And I think with what I know about our political economy and what, we tend to use some of these monies for, we would still spend that money and it will not be enough. And so I come back to my point
I
that
see your
says that
skepticism.
If 91 doesn't do anything for you, what would 9 do?
I see that skepticism. Now, the city, I know you still haven't had the chance to investigate this budget yet. What are your expectations of the fight against depreciation, the city's depreciation? Now, I ask this question particularly against the backdrop of us trying to identify what exactly the causative factors for the city's depreciation are. Is the city, or has the city been suffering over the years, especially for some months now? Has the city's depreciation been due largely to the question of balance of trade deficit? And I ask you this because there are arguments out there that Ghana actually had a trade surplus last year, even though the figure was marginal. But apparently that we had a trade surplus. But is the issue of balance of trade deficit a fundamental reason why the city is suffering? If not, what, in your opinion, are the reasons why the city continues to slide against the dollar, and how do we arrest the process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed cocktail. So yes, certainly the balance of trade issues, your trade surplus, all of that feature your reserve levels and the current account. All of those things feature. But also, it's a question of like market expectations. So yes, you may have a positive balance of trade, but do the market participants expect that government would, keep tight on its policy and rein in, for example, unnecessary, or some people would say, quote unquote, frivolous expenditure. So there's the hardcore kind of quantitative aspect to it, and then there's also the market sentiment element that drives what the exchange rate would or would not be. But if you actually look at the numbers too, in the last couple of years, I mean, even with COVID, we saw a relative stability in the exchange rate. The year before, it was doing around 10 or so % depreciation. The real challenge will be this year, 2021, where we are now going to be looking at the fiscal numbers coming through for 2020. So we're expecting the fiscal numbers for the deficit, the current account, and all those would tell us, what the structural factors or issues are. And they in turn will feed into, the market sentiment or expectation. Also, government says that they want to borrow $5 billion from the international market. When all those monies, hopefully they come in, then they also add an additional buffer or cushion. But the other point is the whole thing about, what we import and what we export and the value that is created out of it. I don't want to use the famous saying that if the fundamentals are weak, then the exchange rate would expose you, if I do recall. That is sort of partly true, but it's a fundamental economic issue for me. If we can take advantage of AFCTA, export more, create more value, create the linkages between the agri-value chain and your technical education, and have a whole philosophical paradigm that thinks more about outputs and less about inputs. So less about let's build road, let's build hospital, but asking questions around what is the productivity value add? Can we measure? Can we quantify? How do we improve those things? If we think at that sort of, for me, systems or structural level, then we would actually be going somewhere in terms of dealing with the issues of the city. The city is only a symptom, right, of a bigger issue in terms of how your economy is organized.
The question of public debt, as I promised, will be coming to. The parties obviously disagree on what the stock of public debt is, depending on which party you're speaking to and whether the party is in government or not. The public debt,
exactly.
The public debt sounds a certain way, either it's too big or it's too small, and whether it is justifiably accumulated or it's a problem. You, as an economist, obviously detached from the politics, what is Ghana's public debt stock, and how problematic is it?
It's problematic, that I can tell you. If you look at the IMF's what they call the DSA, debt sustainability analysis, Ghana is classified at risk of high debt distress, and that has been the case even before COVID, right? So we rebased the economy, and overnight what happened was our debt to GDP ratios went below 60%. At one point it was like 56 or so percent. But overnight, of course, we went on the binge borrowing spree again. And as we speak currently, we're looking at between 75 and 77%, debt to GDP for this for 2020, right? Not including what would even come in 2021. There are two big issues that I maybe can explain on that. On the metric itself, like the debt to GDP, you have two numbers. One is your debt, you're dividing it by the GDP. Problem is that historically our GDP has been growing in single digits, right? And the debt is actually been accumulating in double digits. So there you even have a problem because one is growing faster than the other. And then the question is, when we incur those debts, what do we have to show for it in terms of like the investment into the real sector of the economy that enhances productivity? So you see me hammering on and on and on about productivity, because if we don't address that fundamental productivity problem, we will still keep borrowing, we will still keep investing into all these ventures, but it would not translate into productive gains or enhance the total factor productivity and our debt to GDP ratios or any other metric that one want to look at would be way out of date. So currently Ghana's debt is quite a difficult one. It's already been classified as being at risk of high debt distress. As for the politicians, they always play what I call the kokofu football with the debt, right? So one will come and say, "Oh, this person did this and this person did that." But look, when you crunch the numbers and you look at it in an objective and in an unbiased manner, you see that a lot of the development in this economy pretty much been debt financed. So we just keep borrowing, but we keep borrowing, but not necessarily investing in a way and manner that actually increases productivity, and we're back to ground zero. I don't think, though, that Ghana would necessarily be applying for the likes of the ongoing debt suspension servicing initiative, the DSSI, or the new one that is being proposed, which is the G20 Common Framework for Debt Resolution. I'm not sure Ghana would want to participate in any of that, because the big concern there also is that if you apply to get a debt relief or debt reprieve, like it happened with HIPIC, right, in the early 2000s, the market will see that as a default and you'll be punished. So if you now want to go and borrow 5 billion in Eurobonds, etc., what that means is you then have to pay an extra premium on what you would have paid or you would have hitherto pay on those yields. So it's a bit of a conundrum.
Your position appears to be the speculation of many, that perhaps the reason we are not applying for debt suspension, as many African countries have already applied for, particularly in light of COVID, given all the risks that the economy and the shocks that the economy has endured because of the COVID scenario. Many analysts see the non-application for the suspension as actually due to what you are saying, i.e. the prospect of heightening the cost of borrowing. If investors see you as a high-risk country, given your prospect of applying for suspension once you have any difficulty or challenges, affecting your economy. But from a more practical and from a more pragmatic standpoint, do you think that we should continue paying our debts? We should continue servicing our debts and paying all these interests and paying upon all the coupons that are due, among others? Should we continue the business as usual, knowing that the reality is that the shocks are painful and things are difficult? What do you think as an economist?
You have to sit down and negotiate with the debt holders. There are different players in this scheme of things, and let me explain. So you have debt that is owed to the multilateral development banks, so like your IMFs and the World Banks of this world, whom you can sit down and have some kind of engagement with to get potential reprieve or relief on both principal and interest. Then you do have the other bilateral players. So here you're looking at countries, right? So maybe a China or a France or Britain who also lend money to the government, and even times through the ECA, so the export credit agencies. That's another strand. And then the third strand, which is where Ghana finds itself really in, is the private sector side of the debt. This is where your Eurobonds and other commercial paper that we sell falls in. And I mentioned earlier that since 2007, we have borrowed close to 12 billion. If we raise the additional 5 billion that we want, right? That's about 17 billion. That is close to what we want to use to fund for Ghana Cares, the Obatampa program. So it becomes difficult, really, especially on the private credit side of things. If you take that into dollars, it's roughly about $16 or $17. So our total Eurobond borrowings plus what we propose to borrow currently, if you sum them up, will be more or less equivalent to what we want to use to fund Obatampa. But that's kind of like beside the point. The point is that the private debt holdings, the Eurobonds that we've got, it's very difficult to kind of ask for like a haircut, right, on them. So I think for sure Ghana will meet its debt obligations. I don't see that not happening, particularly because of the signaling effect. The signaling effect being that if you say that you're not going to honor those obligations or even defer the interest payments on it, then on what basis do you now also go to the market and say, give me 5 billion to meet, my budgetary needs? So it just is something that, would not happen. It may happen on the bilateral debt side. So your IMFs and the World Banks, you may have some agreement on the side. But on the private sector debt side, and just to give you a number, our total external debt, the commercial debt aspect of that is actually around 48 or so % of our total external debt. So roughly about half of that, and that's not chicken change.
Dr. Theo Acheampong is an economist and a political risk analyst. I have been having a conversation with him on a broad range of issues, particularly affecting the budgets and general economic policy. He has extensive experience working in Africa and advising many countries in that respect. He's worked with firms such as Crystal Energy, IHS Markets, and Kina Advisory Limited, among others. Dr. Acheampong is a non-resident fellow at Imani and other NGOs in Ghana. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives, and I think we've been enlightened. I wish to thank you, the listeners. You've been on Townhall Talk on Asaase Radio. The program has been sponsored by the Magdan Shipping Company Limited, your total logistics partner. Have a wonderful weekend. My name is Kofi Abuchi.